the Spring Boot REST APIs get all of the attention, but sometimes you just need to create a Spring Boot console application that can hit a back-end database and do a little bit of auto wiring and dependency injection. And it's not that hard to do. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring Boot advocates. And I quickly wanted to show you how to put together a simple little console-based Spring Boot application that does dependency injection, hits a back-end database, can be auto-wired, and it can all be run from a main method. But in order to do that, we got to create a Spring Boot project, and that is exactly what we're going to do next. If we're going to create a standalone Spring Boot console application, the first thing we need to do is create a Spring Boot project. And we're going to be creating a little rock, paper, scissors application here. So I'm going to create a brand new project, a Spring starter project here. I do have the Spring tools installed in this IDE, and I'm going to call it my Rochambeau. Rochambeau is what they call rock, papers, and scissors in Asia, I believe. I'm going to call it my Rochambeau Spring Console app. It's going to be of type Maven, so make sure you've made this change. It's going to be com.mcnz.rps as the group and package name. And to start off, I want to add a little database stuff to this a little bit later. But to start off, don't add anything other than Spring Dev Tools. This will give you the core Spring Boot APIs, the core Spring framework. But we'll add in a little bit of Spring Data and Spring JDBC in just a moment. But for starters, let's just start there. Create this application. Now see the progress bar spinning in the bottom right hand corner. When that finishes, you can come over here, open up the project, and you'll see that's a long class name. You will see the Spring Boot class, and you'll notice that it's annotated with Spring Boot annotation there. That is the heart of your Spring Boot apps. Now, people that want to create a standalone Spring Boot console app are tempted to put some code in the main method there, but do not do that. That code won't run within the context of Spring. It'll run, but it won't have access to dependency injection. It won't have access to Spring Data, Spring JPA, any of the great Spring stuff. If you want to create a Spring application, standalone application that can take advantage of all of the things in the Spring context, what you have to do is you have to implement CommandLineRunner. Now, I'll have two problems there. One is the fact that I have to organize that import. So I'm going to right click and say source, organize imports, and boom, you'll end up seeing that import getting added up there for the CommandLineRunner. I'll click save. And then do you see that red X there? Well, if you do, you should get your eyes checked because it's a white X inside of a red circle. But that does say, hey, there are unimplemented methods. This CommandLineRunner interface requires a run method, and that's where you put all of the code that you would normally have put inside of a main method. So I'm going to type, add those unimplemented methods, and boom, all of a sudden we have this run method here. And you can put all of the code that you want in here to support your console-based standalone Spring Boot app. So I want this to be a little rock, paper, scissors application. So, starting off, I'm going to say, something like, what will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? So that's just going to print out a prompt to the user at the console. Why don't we treat that like our hello world and just right click on this application, say run as Spring Boot app. And let's see if that at least gets printed out like we would expect in a normal Java standalone application. And indeed, boom, right there it does. What will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? So here's what I'd like to do now. I'd like to actually just implement rock, paper, and scissors very, very quickly. So we've got some code to work with. Once we've done that, I like to create a score class that we can inject into this application to test out a dependency injection. And then I'd like to add some Spring Data, JDBC, and the H2 database so that we can actually persist it. And you can take a look at injecting Spring repositories into the code. But let's walk before we can run. Let's tidy this up here. If we're going to be creating a little rock, paper, scissors application, we probably want to keep track of the result in the game, right? So I'm just going to create a string variable to hold the result, and then we'll keep track of what the client chooses as their gesture, whether they choose rock, paper, or scissors. So we'll create a variable to keep track of their gesture, and then, well, why don't we use the scanner class to get some input from the user? So scanner equals new scanner, and the scanner is going to scan the console for input, system input, console-based input from the user. I got to do Control-Shift-O just because that scanner class is in that util package. But once we get that in, there we go. Boom, Bob is your uncle. Looks like some bad code slid in there. With the scanner initialized, I can just ask for what the user's gesture is. So I can say gesture equals scanner dot next, and that just gives me the next token, the next thing that somebody's typed in. And so if they've typed in rock or paper, scissors, I can tell. And we're going to say the server always chooses rock. So what can we say? If the gesture dot equals ignore case, and I know I'm going quickly here, feel free to pause. But this is all Java code here, so people kind of want to get into the Spring. So feel free to pause or even jump ahead to the next section if you want, or stick with me. I'd love that. But if the gesture equals paper, I mean, what happens if the gesture equals paper? Well, I guess that means that the result is equal to a win for the client. So we'll just say result equals win. That all looks good to me. And I don't know, after we've figured that all out, we can say system.out.println you picked plus gesture. And then system.out.println the result is a, and then plus result, right? So there we go. Now this isn't in a loop, so this will run once. It'll be one and done. But we'll deal with doing this on and on in just a moment. Let's see if this will run. So a little right click, run as a Spring Boot app. You could actually just say run as main method here. I think that would work just fine. But let's see, what would be rock, paper, scissors? We're going to say paper because that's the only one we're handling. It says you picked paper. The result is a win. Well, the result is a little typo there, but I'm happy with that, right? So it looks like we're doing pretty good. I think the only thing we need to do now is handle what? Scissors, that would be a loss, and rock, which would be a tie, right? So now we've got this all looking a lot better. What will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? I think we got a good class going on here. I think I'm going to move this down a little bit. Put that before the gesture. And what? It's always a good idea to close the scanner when you're done with it. And then I think all of this can just go in a while loop, right? So say source surround with is what I want, and I'm going to surround it with a do while loop. And I guess the condition is the gesture is not equal to I don't know, the letter Q or something like that, right? So as long as somebody doesn't type in the letter Q, it's all going to work. And let's see, gesture.equals ig lowercase is what it is. So there we go. I think this will work indefinitely. We may need to adjust what's inside that while loop a little bit, do a little formatting here. Well, I think that's a handsome little standalone application. But does it work is the question. So okay, so let's play a little rock, paper, scissors here before we move on to the next step. So we'll run this application, run it as a standalone application. What will it be? I'll say rock. You pick rock, it's a tie. Paper, you pick paper, it's a win. Do paper again, it's a win. Scissors. Okay, you pick scissors, it's a loss. What will it be? Q. And it says, oh, the result is a loss. That doesn't look good, but it does exit the program. So maybe we need to improve this just a little bit and maybe add an if statement there, or even do while gesture is not equal to Q. In fact, that's probably what we want, right? So we probably want to go up there and do while. I'm going to worry about that a little bit later. We'll tighten this up later. An if and a break would probably do it. So after we get the input, if gesture equals ignore case Q, and we want to see if it's Q, then just tighten this up, like break out of there. And if we do that, then we can just make this an infinite loop. I don't know, that will work a little bit better. Okay, we're just tighten this up a little bit, but our focus isn't supposed to be on Java, right? Our focus is supposed to be on Spring Boot. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to keep track of the score in this application. And in order to keep track of the score, the wins, losses, and ties, what we're going to need is we're going to need a class. We're going to need a Java bean that represents that. And the Java bean that represents that is just the score class. So I can just say, let's create a brand new class. We'll call it score. We might do some database stuff. So we'll have a numeric primary key called ID. We don't really need that for our domain model, but I'm thinking ahead. And really, we just want int wins, losses, and ties, right? We want to keep track of the wins, losses, and ties. We probably want to create a constructor for this. So I'm going to create a constructor, generate constructor using fields. I'm going to have a constructor that uses everything except the ID. And every good class should have a default constructor too, so we'll add that in. And overall, I think that looks pretty good, right? We keep track of the score. The score's got wins, losses, and ties, maybe even a primary key that we'll call ID. We've got a constructor. You know, Java beans are supposed to have getters and setters, so we can add those in as well if we want. Probably shouldn't have a setter for the ID, but whatever, I'll throw it in there. It messes up the organization of all my code because of where my cursor was positioned when I did it, but that's easy enough to fix. And so here we go. We've now got the score. Now here's what I want to do with the score. I would like to inject the score into the application. I want the score to be treated as a singleton object for the application, which by default auto-wired beans are in Spring Boot. And I would like to inject this into the class. So in order to do that, two things have to happen. I have to annotate this with component. Control-Shift-O brings in the component reference, the component package. And then over here, I need to auto-wire that in. So I add the reference to the score. So I say score, score. So I want access to the score. I don't create it. We're going to allow Spring Boot to auto-wire it in. And you know what? over here, for the default score, I'm just going to say wins equals Wayne Gretzky, ties equals Mario Lemieux, and losses equals Eric Lindros or something like that. I'm only doing that. Normally we'd have them as zeros, but right now when Spring Boot injects a bean into your class, it'll call the default constructor when it creates it. And the default constructor just gives us zeros. So why don't we do something interesting so that we know that it's actually our code being called. So we've got a Java bean decorated with the component annotation. We are auto-wiring it into the class right here. And with that auto-wired into the class, well, it's pretty easy to access it. All I have to do is go down here and say, I don't know, if the gesture is a win, score.wins++. If it's a loss, score.losses++. And if it's a tie, score.ties++. Never been to Thailand, but I hear it's a great place. So we've now auto-wired that component in. That is some deep Spring stuff right there, auto-wiring one of our own components. And we've been able to bring it in here and actually manipulate it a little bit, right? Increase the wins, increase the losses, increase the ties. Maybe, just maybe, we'll print out the score. So right at the end, we'll print out the score to the user. Well, that's pretty cool. Now, we should actually have a little toString method here. So I can say source generate toString. So we'll add the toString in there, may as well. And now when this code runs, it's actually going to look super interesting. So I'm going to highlight this class. I'm going to say right-click, run as Spring Boot app. I do want you to kind of see that auto-wired annotation in there. So run as Spring Boot app. What will it be? Rock. It says the wins is 99, losses is 88, and the ties is 67 because it was originally Mario Lemieux, right? 66. If I now go in here and say rock again, it's 68. If I say paper, it is 100 wins. We've gone from Wayne Gretzky to a solid Borden or a solid Benjamin there. And then scissors, 89, right? So our application's working. I'll type in Q. The program exits, and life is good. So we're now getting on the path of dependency injection in Spring. We actually have a standalone Spring Boot application running that does dependency injection and works at the command line and even takes command line input from the user. Now the next thing I'm going to do, if you stick around, and please do, is I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of JDBC into this by using a CRUD repository and actually persisting that score object to the database rather than just injecting it in as a component. And that is what we're going to do next. So now for our next trick, which is to introduce a little bit of Spring Data JDBC into this standalone Spring Boot console application. Now, we didn't include that starter when we started. So we actually have to go back to our project and right-click on it and select Spring Add Starters. And this will allow us to select Spring Data JDBC. And I'm also want to use the embedded H2 database. So we'll kick things off like this. We'll dig in and go to SQL, and it's Spring Data JDBC that I want. Now you notice the scroll bars aren't there. You got to kind of jiggle this a little bit there. Okay, now the scroll bars appear. And I also want to use the embedded H2 database. This will greatly simplify testing and prototyping with this embedded database that we can use. So I'm going to click Next. It's going to say to me, well, we've got some new dependencies that aren't in your existing code. Do you actually want to copy them? So I've got this little option here to copy all of them, and I'm going to click OK, copy them all. So they all get copied over. I'm going to click Finish. When I click Finish, I'm going to open up the pom.xml file, and I'm just going to take a look at what was added and make sure that it all looks right. So I'm over here in the POM, and I want to see a reference to H2 starter. And boom, I can see it. That's not really a starter, more just a dependency. And I want to see Spring Data JDBC, and I can see that as well. So those are both good. Sometimes when you do that, I like to do a run as Maven build. That is just going to go out to, sorry, not Maven build. I like to do a Maven install. That's just actually going to build the application, and it should actually reach out to Maven Central to pull in any Maven, any SpringBoot files or dependency files that aren't on my local system at the current time, right? So that's just a good thing to do. A couple of other things we need to do. When you work with H2, for that matter, when you work with any database, you can actually put a setup script into your resources folder. So I'm going to create a new setup script in this resources folder here, and I'm going to call it schema.sql, schema.sql. And in this schema, I'm just going to add in the SQL that is required in order to create this score table in the database. There you go. It should all be on one line, but that allows you to see it. By the way, if you want some of this code, it's all over on my GitHub account, so I should be linking to it in the description below, so take a look at that. But if you put this create statement in this schema.sql file, and you can see there's not much to it. The integer, the ID is of type integer with auto increment. Wins is integer, loss is integers, tie is integer, and the primary key is that ID. That's all pretty straightforward. The other thing you can do is you can seed the database as well. So if you actually come over here and create a new file called data.sql, that will actually load into that embedded H2 database every time the application runs. So 30, 20, and 10, not Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, and Eric Lindros, 99, 66, 88. That is what should get inserted into the database at the start. And it also gets inserted with primary key 1. So that's the one that we're actually going to go and query in our application. So that just sets up the database element for our application. If you haven't used H2 before, the way that works is actually really super cool. It makes working with databases incredibly easy. Now, if we want to work with a database, we need to be able to do CRUD operations. And there's something that makes CRUD operations incredibly simple when you're working with Spring Boot. All you have to do is create a brand new interface in your project. I'm going to call it Score Repository. Make sure I spelled that correctly, Score Repository. A couple little things that I have to do here. First of all, this has to have the @repository annotation on it. So do a little Control-Shift-O and organize your imports. And it also has to extend CRUD repository and reference your class and its primary key. A little Control-Shift-O, we're saved. This will actually give me access to all of the add, delete, insert, all of those operations inside of my code. So this is going to make my life in terms of doing development a whole heck of a lot easier. Okay, so how do we use this? Well, I'm going to head over to my application. And just like I auto-wired the score, I'm going to auto-wire in the score repository. We'll give it the name Score Repo. That all looks fantastic to me. So now we've wired in that score repo, and inside of our code, rather than pulling the score from the auto injection above, we can pull the score in our code from the database. All I have to say is score equals score repo dot find by ID. And you notice that all of those methods are magically there, even though we didn't see them in the interface. The ID that we have is 1, right? Like we just said that we're going to go after that first record that we've inserted into the database. So we're just explicitly stating that it's going to be 1. And this returns an optional, so I think you just have to put get at the end there to actually get it. That gives you the chance to deal with null pointers or times when the data doesn't actually come back. But I think in this simple application, it should. Now, I do have a shadow variable there, right? I've got score in the method, and I've got score auto wired in. That is not a good thing. Now, a lot of people would think that you couldn't have two variables with the same name, because they have different scopes. It's actually going to be valid, but we don't need to auto wire in the score anymore, so we'll comment that out. And now this all looks pretty good. This is actually going to switch this from doing standard standard auto wiring and using a singleton to actually saving this information. So I think that is all pretty good. The only thing that I think we need to add here is right at the end of the method, I need to do score repo dot save. And I need to save the score. And so that way when the game ends, the score gets saved. I guess theoretically you could save it after we increase it each time, right? So yeah, maybe we'll do that. Okay, so increase the number of ties, increase the number of losses, increase the number of wins. And each time we do that, increase the score. That makes a whole lot of sense too. And this is close to it. Now, there is one last thing that I need to do. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, just let you see the code. It's all looking interesting, all looking fairly cool. There's that auto wiring, which is really important there. So that gives you a look at the whole class. Now here's the last thing that I always forget to do. You have to go to that ID and annotate it with @ID. If you don't have that, the application is going to try and persist your data. The Spring Data JDBC is going to persist your data, won't know what the ID is, and it'll cause big problems. Also, I don't know if I like that toString right up there, so I'm going to move that down to the bottom of the class, which I think is more standard. That was the code that was auto-created for me. But there's the score class if you want to see it. There's the annotations. Not too much going on there, right? It's fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. And that's sort of the promise of Spring Boot, just to make software development super easy. Okay, I think that's it now. Let's take one last look at the score repository. Extends CrudRepository, score and long. The data should go into the database. The schema should get created. Everything is in my POM file. Well, I think I'm rip ready and raring to go. So let's right click and say run as Spring Boot application. Now let's see what happens. So it says, what will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? I'm going to type in rock. It says, what will it be again? I'll say rock. And notice it's starting with 30, 20, and 10 was the start. Before we had Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, and Eric Lindros. Here we've got the data from our database. So we know that we're not going to this object anymore. We're not going to that constructor. We're not auto-wiring in just a Java bean. Instead, we're actually getting the data that was persisted into the database. Okay, so our finder method is working, and so is all of the rest of our code. So I'll take a look at this console application. I think it all looks good. What will it be? Rock, paper, or scissors? I'll say paper. I'll say paper again because I like winning. I'll say paper again. Am I the client or am I the server? I don't know. I'm kind of the server too. Maybe I'm losing. I don't know. Maybe Maybe we should just do a tie. But you can see we've got 33, 20, and 13. If I quit the application now, well, I exit out, we close all of our resources. And if we were to start this up again and we didn't actually recreate the database every single time, all of the data would actually end up getting persisted. Now, all of this is pretty cool, and you have to admit, it's pretty impressive to see all of this working, in a fairly short period of time, all in a standalone application. We have got SpringBoot working, we've got the Spring framework working, we've got auto-wiring working, we've got the ability to take input from the user from the console, and we've even used Spring Data JDBC to connect our application to a database, query it, and update it as well. And we also got to see just how you can use H2 to, well, quickly create a database for you and update it. Now, one thing about our application is every time we stop the application, start it up again, we'll end up getting that database recreated, so it's not persisted. But if you actually want to use the H2 database and not just use stuff embedded in memory, but actually write to the file system so it'll persist after a shutdown, I've actually got a full tutorial on the server side about that, so please check that out. Otherwise, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. If you did, why don't you head over to theserverside.com. I'm the editor-in-chief over there. We got lots of great tutorials on Spring, Spring Boot, Jakarta EE, Git, GitHub, DevOps, Docker, containers, Kubernetes, you name it. If you're interested in my personal antics, you can follow me on Twitter at CameronMC. And I'm also the author of a few books. You can see that there is, well, what is WebSphere back there? I'm not selling too many copies of that. But Hibernate Made Easy is all about Hibernate and JPA. So if you're doing persistence, feel free to pick that up. And also, you'll notice Pickering is Springfield, which is a little book I wrote about The Simpsons, available on Amazon. And also, I helped edit the Scrum Master Certification Guide by Darcy DeClute at Scrumptious on Twitter. So if you're interested in getting Scrum Master certified, or you know somebody who is, that's highly recommended. A lot of people are reading that book and scoring 100% on both the product owner and Scrum Master exam on their first try, so I couldn't recommend it more. Anyways, that's about it. Last thing I would say is if you're watching this on YouTube, why don't you subscribe on YouTube?